January rarely feels the way people expect it to. There's an assumption built into the calendar that something is supposed to reset, that the moment the year turns, you should feel clearer, lighter, more motivated, or at least more hopeful than you did a week ago. And for a lot of people, that doesn't happen. Instead, January often feels flat or exposed or oddly quiet in a way that's not exactly peaceful. The decorations come down, the messages slow, the emotional noise drops out, and what's left is you, your routines, your patterns, your unresolved thoughts, your actual life without the seasonal scaffolding wrapped around it. That experience gets interpreted as failure, as if you missed the memo, as if something inside you didn't get the update that it's a new year now. But psychologically, that flatness is not a problem, it's information. You see, December is a month of amplification, memory, meaning, expectation, performance, all of it turned up at once. January isn't a beginning in the emotional sense, it's a contrast. The volume drops, the signals fade, and when the stimulation disappears, people mistake the absence of intensity for the absence of meaning. Nothing is wrong because you don't feel transformed. The calendar didn't change you. It just stopped distracting you. And that moment, uncomfortable as it can be, is actually one of the most honest psychological entry points into a new year you'll ever get.
Hello and welcome to The Psychology of Us with Professor RJ Starr, where we explore the mind's influence on life, relationships, and society. RJ Starr is an existential psychologist, professor, and author dedicated to exploring the core challenges of human existence, how we find meaning, embrace responsibility, and navigate life's challenges. Known for a thought-provoking yet accessible approach, RJ inspires listeners to cultivate self-awareness, emotional intelligence, authenticity, and purpose. This podcast is designed for all psychology enthusiasts, practitioners, students, and anyone curious about why we think, feel, and behave the way we do. Each episode unpacks theories, explores complex questions, and offers insights that deepen understanding of the human experience. So settle in, stay curious, and discover the psychology of us.
What I want to do in this episode is slow the new year down a little. Not to drain it of meaning and not to dismiss the desire for change, but to look more honestly at what this moment actually does to people psychologically. Because the new year isn't a reset in the way we're taught to think about it. It doesn't create change on its own. What it does is reveal what's already been accumulating beneath the surface. January functions more like a psychological audit than a fresh start. When the noise of December falls away, when the rituals end and the expectations quiet down, people are left with a clearer view of their patterns, their habits, their emotional posture, and sometimes their dissatisfaction. That can feel disappointing or even destabilizing, especially if you were expecting relief just because the calendar turned. So this isn't an episode about resolutions. It's not about motivation, productivity, or becoming a different version of yourself by force. And it's definitely not about declaring that this is the year everything finally falls into place. Instead, I want to look at why January feels the way it does for so many people. Why that flat or unsettled feeling is so often misunderstood, and how the pressure to reinvent yourself at the start of a year can quietly work against psychological stability rather than support it. We're going to talk about why emotional intensity drops so sharply after the holidays, how identity pressure sneaks into the language of New Year change, why phrases like "this is the year" tend to function more as emotional defenses than genuine clarity, and what a more grounded, honest way of entering a new year can look like. Not a strategy, not a promise, just a psychological posture that makes room for reality instead of trying to override it. Because the psychologically healthy year doesn't begin with excitement or certainty. It begins with attention, with noticing what's actually there once the distractions are gone. And that's where I want to start. For a lot of people, January doesn't feel hopeful. It feels emotionally flat. And that reaction tends to get pathologized very quickly, either internally or by the culture around it. People start asking themselves, what's wrong? Why they don't feel excited? Why the new year didn't deliver the emotional shift it was supposed to? But you see, psychologically, that flatness makes a lot of sense. December is an emotionally saturated month. It's not just busy, it's symbolically dense. Coming right off the heels of Thanksgiving, there's memory layered on top of expectation, social performance layered on top of obligation, meaning layered on top of routine. Even people who dislike the holidays are still immersed in a month that's constantly signaling how they're supposed to feel, what they're supposed to value, and who they're supposed to stay connected to. When that level of stimulation drops, the nervous system notices, the mind notices. The contrast can feel abrupt, almost like a loss, even if nothing concrete has been taken away. What people often interpret as emptiness is actually the absence of amplification. Emotional intensity doesn't equal emotional health, but we live in a culture that quietly trains people to associate the two. When feelings are big and loud and frequent, they're assumed to be meaningful. When things get quieter, people start to worry that something has gone missing. That's why January can feel unsettling rather than peaceful. It's not numbness. It's not depression by default. It's neutrality appearing after weeks of emotional overexposure. And neutrality is unfamiliar to a lot of people. There's also a loss of structure that happens all at once. December comes with built-in scripts. There are places you're supposed to go, people you're supposed to see, ways that you're supposed to show up. January removes most of that scaffolding. Calendars open up, inboxes quiet down, social cues become less directive. Without external structure, people are left with internal regulation. And if that skill hasn't been practiced much, the sudden quiet can feel disorienting rather than restorative. So people reach for explanations. They assume the flatness means they're ungrateful or burned out or broken in some way. But often it's just the nervous system recalibrating after an extended period of emotional demand. The problem isn't that January feels different. The problem is that we weren't taught what different feels like when it isn't dramatic. Silence gets misread as absence. Stillness gets confused with stagnation. Emotional neutrality gets framed as failure. But psychologically, those states are often precursors to clarity, not evidence against it. January, you see, strips away the noise. And when the noise disappears, what becomes visible isn't a problem that needs fixing. It's a baseline that most people rarely get to see. Once that quiet sets in, another pressure tends to surface. It's subtler than the emotional flatness, but just as powerful. The pressure to become someone else.
The Psychology of Being Human, an authoritative guide to mind, emotion, and meaning by RJ Starr is now available worldwide in hardcover, paperback, and ebook. This book is an in-depth, accessible guide to understanding why we feel what we feel, why we think the way we think, and why human behavior is rarely as irrational as it appears. Across 40 chapters, the book explores the foundations of the mind, emotional life, identity formation, trauma, resilience, belief systems, culture, and the lifelong task of psychological integration. It explains complex ideas clearly while respecting the depth and dignity of human experience. Readers who want more than trends or buzzwords will find a serious, thoughtful synthesis of modern psychology, how emotions function, how patterns form, how meaning is constructed, and how we evolve across the lifespan if you want a book that deepens your self-understanding and expands your capacity to make sense of others. this is the one to read. The Psychology of Being Human, an authoritative guide to mind, emotion, and meaning by RJ Starr is available now, wherever books are sold.
You see, friends, the new year carries an unspoken message that's easy to miss because it's so normalized. If nothing changes now, then something must be wrong. If you don't take advantage of this moment, you've wasted an opportunity. If you're still struggling with the same things, then you failed to use the reset correctly. That message doesn't come from nowhere. It's reinforced constantly through resolution culture, productivity narratives, and the language of reinvention. New year, new habits, new year, new body, new year, new mindset, new year, new relationship, new year, new weight loss. The implication is that continuity equals stagnation and that psychological health requires rupture. But identity doesn't work that way. Most change that lasts doesn't come from rejecting who you've been. It comes from understanding why certain patterns formed in the first place. When change efforts are built on frustration, embarrassment, or quiet self-disgust, they tend to collapse the moment the motivation fades. Not because the person's weak, but because the foundation was unstable. You see, there's an important difference between growth and erasure. Growth preserves continuity. Erasure demands distance from parts of the self that feel inconvenient or uncomfortable. And January quietly encourages erasure under the guise of improvement. That's why so many people experience a spike in self-criticism this time of year. The internal dialogue becomes harsher. Comparisons intensify. The focus shifts from curiosity to correction. Instead of asking what's actually happening in their lives, people start asking who they are failing to be. Psychologically, that kind of identity pressure creates tension rather than momentum. It fractures attention. It narrows emotional bandwidth. It turns self-observation into surveillance. And when people feel watched by their own expectations, they don't explore, they perform. That's one of the reasons resolutions so often feel brittle. They're not anchored in understanding. They're anchored in urgency. And urgency doesn't sustain change. It actually exhausts it. Real development is usually quieter than the New Year narrative allows. It involves repetition. It involves relapse. It involves staying in relationship with parts of yourself that don't immediately cooperate. None of that fits neatly into a calendar-based transformation story. The problem isn't wanting to change. The problem is being taught that change requires disowning who you are now. When identity becomes a project to fix rather than a system to understand, people lose the very stability they need in order to grow. There's a phrase that shows up every January that sounds hopeful on the surface, but carries a lot of psychological weight underneath it. This is the year. It gets said casually, sometimes even jokingly, but it functions as a declaration, a line drawn between what came before and what's supposed to come next. And for many people, that declaration isn't really about optimism. It's about protection. Uncertainty is uncomfortable. Continuity can be even more uncomfortable. When people look ahead and can't see clear evidence that things will change on their own, the mind reaches for certainty. Declaring the year successful in advance becomes a way to manage anxiety about repetition, about being in the same emotional, relational, or professional position 12 months from now. So the statement isn't neutral, it's defensive. It's an attempt to control an outcome that hasn't happened yet, to assert agency over a future that still contains a hell of a lot of unknowns. And while that can feel empowering in the moment, it often backfires. Because once a year is declared meaningful, productive, or transformative, every deviation starts to feel like a threat. Missed goals become evidence. Slow progress becomes discouraging. Normal setbacks feel heavier than they otherwise would because they don't just represent difficulty, they represent a crack in the story you told yourself about how this year was supposed to go. That's how pressure quietly replaces hope. There's a difference, you see, between hope and certainty. Hope leaves room for reality to unfold. Certainty demands compliance. And when we confuse the two, we end up policing our own experience rather than responding to it. This is one of the quieter ways adults engage in magical thinking, not in an overtly irrational sense, but in the belief that intention alone can insulate them from disappointment. That naming the year, claiming it, or declaring it will somehow reduce the risk of things staying difficult. But psychological resilience doesn't come from declaring outcomes. It comes from tolerating, not knowing how things will turn out, without needing to control the narrative in advance. When people tell themselves this is the year, they're often trying to outrun a deeper fear. The fear that change might be slower than they want. The fear that effort won't guarantee results. The fear that they'll have to stay in relationship with uncertainty longer than feels comfortable. The irony is that the more tightly people grip the story of the year, the less flexible they become inside it. And flexibility, not certainty, is what actually allows people to adapt when life doesn't follow the script. There's a quieter way to enter a year that doesn't require declarations, resolution, or reinvention. It starts with responsiveness rather than certainty, with paying attention instead of projecting outcomes, with allowing the year to unfold before deciding what it's supposed to mean. That posture feels unfamiliar because it doesn't offer the emotional relief that promises do. It doesn't carry a sense of control. It doesn't produce an immediate narrative you can hold on to. But psychologically, it's far more stable. Responsiveness means noticing patterns without rushing to correct them. It means observing where energy actually goes rather than where you think it should go. It means allowing continuity of self instead of demanding rupture in the name of growth. You don't need a theme for the year in order to live it well. You don't need motivation in January in order to move forward. And you don't need to feel different just because the calendar changed. What January offers, if anything, is clarity. Not clarity about the future, but clarity about the present, about what remains when stimulation drops, about what habits persist without external pressure, about what parts of your life feel stable and which ones quietly ask for attention. That information doesn't require action right away. It requires respect. When people give themselves permission to stay attentive rather than performative, something important shifts. Self-observation becomes less adversarial. Experience becomes less something to manage and more something to understand. The nervous system settles not because everything's resolved, but because it's no longer being forced into a storyline it can't sustain. A psychologically healthy year doesn't begin with enthusiasm. It begins with honesty, with allowing yourself to see where you are without turning that awareness into an indictment. Change that lasts tends to emerge from that kind of stability, not from pressure, not from declarations, but from sustained contact with reality. January doesn't ask you to become someone else. It asks you to stop distracting yourself long enough to notice what's already there. And that's enough to begin with.
That wraps up this episode of The Psychology of Us with Professor RJ Starr. Each conversation is a step toward greater understanding of ourselves, each other, and the forces that shape human behavior. Listeners are invited to continue the conversation
by sharing their thoughts, questions, and topic suggestions at profrjstarr@outlook.com. Every message helps shape future episodes, ensuring the discussions remain relevant, thought-provoking, and meaningful. For those who find value in these explorations, subscribing and leaving a review is a great way to support the podcast and bring these insights to a wider audience. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and keep exploring the psychology of us.
Do you ever feel paralyzed by possibility? Like the sheer weight of choice in modern life isn't liberating, but crushing? That the freedom we celebrate often feels more like a burden? You're not alone. That feeling is at the heart of the new book, The Burden of Freedom: Existential Psychology and the Human Struggle with Uncertainty, by RJ Starr. Why does our most celebrated ideal so often feel like an inescapable weight? This book takes you on a deep dive, exploring the insights of existential thinkers like Kierkegaard, who described the dizziness of freedom, and Sartre, who declared we are condemned to be free. RJ Starr bridges these profound ideas with modern psychology, examining the immense weight of responsibility that shadows every choice. The modern paradox of choice, where endless options lead to paralysis and regret. How the digital age, with its curated identities and algorithms, shapes and sometimes restricts our sense of self. Our deep human struggle to live meaningfully in a world without guarantees, and the powerful ways we try to flee from our own freedom through denial, blame, conformity, and distraction. The Burden of Freedom isn't a self-help manual offering 5 easy steps. It's an invitation to an honest exploration. It offers a framework for understanding why freedom feels heavy and provides the psychological tools and existential perspective needed to stop avoiding and start choosing. Learn how to cultivate the existential strength to carry your freedom with purpose, navigate uncertainty with courage, and build a life that isn't just lived, but is authentically chosen. Stop being paralyzed. Start living deliberately. Find The Burden of Freedom: Existential Psychology and the Human Struggle with Uncertainty by RJ Starr, wherever books are sold.